Hi, I'm Jesse Hirsh, and I'm here with my good friend Allan Gregg for another episode of the Red-Tory podcast. Coming to you after a Canadian election that was successful, if one could say that word, and that there weren't any violence, there weren't any irregularities. I think unlike our neighbors to the south, it would be, I believe, technically impossible to suggest that that was anything other than a fair election. But Allan, what have you been paying attention to? What do you got your eyes on?
Well, I've been kind of distracted by the Canadian election up till now, but I've been, reading a lot of the international stuff that's come off of this election. And first, I can't recall that kind of international attention and focus. That's what's happened on Canada and the reaction throughout. It's, especially from European leaders. And it's been causing me to wonder a little bit about Carney's also his acceptance speech. And I was in the middle, almost in the morning. It was so late. This guy now, he's been elected, and it was incredibly aggressive against Trump. He says, this guy wants to steal our water. He wants to steal our resources. He wants to own us, and very threatening. And then I started thinking, this is a guy, he got elected for a reason. He got elected for a reason because he knows how to manage crisis. He's been through crisis. He's comfortable on a world stage. He knows all of these guys. And we've all looked at this as very positive terms. That Canada's got an opportunity now to play a role on that world stage, both because of the temperament of our new prime minister, but also temper of our times. What if we become the focus of all of that American antagonism? Or before that happens, what if he becomes the rallying point for a lot of these other countries that are obviously anti-tariff, anti-US right now, and as a consequence becomes the focus? So anyway, just speculating on this in the early stages right now, just thinking about it.
And I think it is a huge opportunity. It's one of those kind of casting calls where someone says to you, okay, you've got an audition, and then you get the job, and then it turns out there's another audition. Yeah. And I think that's exactly what's happening now. Because I, too, was taken aback by the international interest in our little backwater and our little contest. I think part of that, quite opportunistically, is there's an audience. And there's an audience for this that isn't just Canadian, that isn't just American. And so on the one hand, I agree with you 100%. This is a very unique opportunity. I would even go in my limited way to say it harks back to Lester B. Pearson and the kind of peacekeeping role that gave Canada a huge reputational boost for several decades.
His role in the Suez Canal and everything that was going on post-World War II, yeah.
Yeah, I feel we are at another one of those opportunities, and it depends how it's played. Because the other thought I had when you were saying that was there's two dualities at work here. One is the difference between a politician when they campaign and the difference between when they govern.
Yeah.
And that, I think, will be a real test of Mark Carney, given that he doesn't have experience. He has institutional experience. He has international experience. He does not have experience as a politician. And it's one thing to campaign when you got the momentum with you and you're going from party to party to party, to actually switching down to the optics, especially given the high media side. And then the other kind of duality here are the two stages. The stages of international diplomacy, which is incredibly important. And that is, in essence, I think, one of the main reasons that he's been hired, quote unquote. But the other is public, the international public, the Canadian public. And that, to me, is an even greater opportunity. Like, that's where Trudeau, he was great at the latter, not the former. Yeah. He was great at courting to the international public opinion, not so good at the diplomacy game.
He was good at the photo ops.
Right.
Everyone wanted to decide with the photo op.
And it strikes me that if Carney could harness his kind of intellectual side, because he has one, and use that as a way not just to try to provide diplomatic leadership, but popular leadership, to be like, I'm the guy who's going to stand up to the bully. Canadians have been doing that historically. That would be huge. And that's the kind of opportunity that I think is before him.
Well, a couple things, just riffing off what you were saying. I mean, one is you're absolutely right. I mean, what people say in an election is often very different what they say after the election and their governing. What surprised me about his acceptance speech is that he was still saber rattling. In fact, in some ways, more aggressively than when it was performatively meeting an electoral office. He didn't have to do that at this juncture. He could have tempered it right down. I think I'm a guy who could really get along with Donald Trump. I think that he's a reasonable person, and I've got negotiating skills, and everything will work out fine. And he wasn't. He said, I'm going to punch this guy right in the nuts. Mm-hmm. And he went on and say, seriously, I'm going to make it absolutely crystal clear that we don't need America to be a prosperous nation. And so that was kind of thing one. Thing two, the international interest is, again, set against the context, because how they're viewing this election is within an international lens. And this is the first guy who has really run an election, incumbent, arguably, against Donald Trump. And he is the first anti-Trump leader in the world. And maybe we should, and Macron wrote on X, looking forward to working with you, elbow and elbow.
Yeah.
Pick up on the elbows up. Here's the president of France picking up on Mike Myers' rhetoric about, the Gordie Howe in all of us.
Well, but more specifically on pop culture rhetoric. Yeah. And it makes sense that a French president would clue into that. Yeah. But I think you're absolutely right. I think he inspires people who also want to be seen as the anti-Trump guy. Mm-hmm. So if he could continue to kick in the nuts, let alone slap in the face as a more lighter but still disrespectful manner, I think that'll be incredibly popular internationally.
He's hosting, I don't think he's going to rush into any negotiations with Trump for that very reason. I think he's going to spend more time on, much as he did when he first became leader. He didn't go to the United States. He went to Europe to visit the Prime Minister of Britain and the President of France. He's hosting a G7 in Kananaskis in June, and Trump is going to be there. And again, you just wonder whether that has the prospect of being a shitstorm if Trump feels that he's being ganged up by all of these buddies who know each other and all are of the same view that he's an idiot.
And that's where, if there's any competence in the White House, they will need a one-on-one before that happens, because it will be an ambush. You're absolutely right. And I think something you've said repeatedly on this show is, Carney needs to have other trade deals in his pocket.
Yeah.
Like, we know that negotiating with the U.S. is at best going to be hostile, and is certainly going to attempt to be one-sided. Like, the U.S. is coming to the bargaining table with some ludicrous preconceptions that certainly make negotiating a fair deal difficult. So Carney needs to have some aces in his sleeve, and that benefits him to delay. To start visiting other people, to start conversations with other people, versus it's in the Trump administration's benefit to do this as soon as possible. Because the other thing I found interesting about Trump's response was not just his praise of Carney, that Carney somehow was the guy he wanted, which is bullshit. Yeah. But then he disparaged Poilievre. Right? Like, he made it very clear that he didn't like the conservative guy and he didn't like Poilievre. And part of me wondered if that was just the usual rambly bullshit of an old man. But the other part of me thought if whether he is wading into Canadian politics again in terms of wanting a different leader on the Tories to help hold Carney accountable. Because if Carney... If we continue with this hypothesis we're cooking up here on the show, that Carney becomes an international touch point, not just diplomatically and politically, but culturally, I mean, that fucks Poilievre. That really shifts the Canadian opposition further towards Trump. If the rest of the world starts seeing us as the anti-Trump, So there's lots of dynamics here that I think are fascinating that put Carney without a honeymoon period, like a honeymoon period in terms of feeling everything's great, but not a honeymoon period in terms of coasting and waiting around. Like he's got shit to do.
There's tremendous pressure for him to get on this right now. Because the other thing I've been kind of watching, and it's something you touched on the other day, in terms of supply chains. UPS just laid off 20,000 people. That the number of shipments that are scheduled into the port of Los Angeles down 36% from this time last year. And that supply chain is starting to slow down already, which means the economy is going to feel it. And you're seeing more and more economists right now saying it doesn't matter what Trump does on tariffs today, because it's already been put in train. And it's already started to have an effect, and this effect you cannot stop.
Yeah.
Because those ships, when they're not in the ocean, they're not in the ocean.
Yeah.
When those delivery men are not at work, they're not at work.
Well, and the other side to this, which I don't think we've touched upon, but it is, I think, equally destructive to Trump, is the price of oil. And the way in which the price of oil, and most of us, of course, have learned this thanks to Landman, the kind of Yellowstone-esque show about the oil industry. But once it goes below $60 a barrel, once the price of oil gets below a certain point, a lot of the U.S. companies just stop. They just stop production completely. And we've had a combination of factors where not only has the price of oil fallen, but OPEC has taken this as an opportunity to radically increase production. Like, they smell blood and they are really leaning in. The flip side to this, the reason I'm reminded by it, is it's like your point about the supply chain. You can't just turn these things around.
No.
Like, once production stops, wells rust, people are laid off. Like, you could start it up back again, but it takes time to get it started up back again. It's not a switch that goes on and off.
And big impact on Canada, because oil sand production is significantly higher than a lot of the other more conventional drilling in the States, and certainly in the OPEC countries.
Now, still on the supply chain side, the variable that I've been wondering about, that I don't think either of us have the answer, but it is, again, I think an interesting component, is how Canada is impacted by that. Like, I don't think we actually fully know how independent our supply chains are from the United States. We know that there's a certain amount of interdependency, like with the auto sector. But I am curious, if American shelves go empty, will Canadian shelves not?
Yeah.
Right? And how much of that is domestic industry? How much of that is, say, European and Chinese imports still continuing to flow into Vancouver, into Montreal? I think that's a big wild card that is a potential liability for Carney, because he's the prime minister. And it's one thing for him to be all tough guy, let's stand up to Trump when everything is good. But when we start to suffer, especially if it is a consequence of stupid American policies, I don't think most Canadians have the political literacy to know who's responsible. They're going to blame whoever's in power.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just look at the repercussions around inflation, too. I mean, every country in the world thought that it was their own domestic government that was responsible. And if we know anything about global trade, is that it's global.
Yeah.
So Canada will not be spared.
Yeah.
If we see this kind of slowdown as a consequence of supply chain, then it's not even supply chain disruptions. It's supply chains just shutting down, just stopping.
Yeah. So going back to the Canadian election, we are still just like 48 hours, not even past. I personally found a lot of the narratives trying to explain what happened kind of frustrating, kind of simplistic. You mentioned you were a little overwhelmed. I'm sure it's kind of in post-election recap and post-election analysis. Before we dive right into sort of how you took it, because I think I know, given that our analysis has been pretty steady week to week, what do you think is wrong? What do you think is misleading in the current public narratives? Because there's no coherence. Like, it's all over the place. but it still seems to be a lot of the same old inside baseball shit rather than what we try to do, which is step back and see the bigger picture, if I'm making any
Well,
sense.
you always tease me about being a legacy media guy, and I am. But reading the Globe and Mail yesterday morning after the election, you look at these articles, you say these could have been written a week ago. I mean, literally, there was not one insight that actually reflected what happened that night. Now, granted that they shut things down at 11 o'clock in the newsroom, and we didn't know all that much in the newsroom. But, there were 60 seats that changed in this election. It wasn't just kind of, Carney had a big rebound and everything was fine after that. The Conservatives won more NDP seats than the Liberals.
Yes.
Won. Again, I wrote an article for the Star today, to my great surprise and probably to my chagrin, given the social media pummeling I would get, saying that the Conservatives would be smart to stick with Poilievre, because he kind of uniquely within that Conservative organization, whether you like him or not, understands to win an election, the Conservatives have got to do something with blue-collar voters. They have to do something with new Canadians. And at some point, they have to penetrate Canada's urban centers. They can't go without one goddamn seat, as they have now for the fourth election in a row in the 50 most densely populated ridings in Canada. But there's lots of evidence that he did pick up blue-collar votes. And you look at, he won one of the Brampton seats, but the other three, the Liberals were able to hold on by less than a percentage point. Yeah. And, that's all kind of Sikh Indian population in there. He won seats in Vancouver Island, which again are loggers, won seats in Windsor, which are auto workers, and London and Hamilton again.
Well, and this is what we talked about last episode, right? Mm-hmm. That the working class fundamentally remains alienated from the primary parties, and it's the Tories who are winning them over legitimately. And I was certainly shocked by Vancouver Island, even though we did talk about that last episode.
Yeah.
But let's unpack a little more. The both. I agree. The kind of, for lack of a better word, I'm going to use the passive electoral success of the Tories, because they did make substantive gains. Mm-hmm. But that's lost in a lot of the narratives that focus on the horse race of politics rather than the nuance of Canadian politics, which is much more regional, which is much more urban versus rural, and as we're arguing, much more based on class. And that's where the Tories not only, I think, outperformed a lot of the other parties, arguably on some level, even the Liberals. But where do you see their future growth? Because I agree that they could still continue to grow, especially if the NDP is dead in the water, in male working class. But how do you see them making inroads in urban areas? Because that's, to me, seems to still be a bastion of big L liberalism. Oh. And women as well. Yeah. I do not see warming up to Pierre Poilievre.
Well, listen, you're not going to win an urban seat if you don't have an environmental policy. These guys had no environmental policy at all for those.
And I don't think they will, short of Red-Tories coming back into the party.
Well, then again, they, when Jim Prentice was the Minister of Environment, I mean, he understood, look, I can't do things that are against the oil and gas industry, like the Liberals did or at least be seen to be doing oil and gas. But I'm a conservative. I can do shit in conservation.
Yeah.
You look at a guy like, Sir David Attenborough, and, there's a great documentary, Me and the Planet, I think was on his occasion of his 93rd birthday. And he talked about all of the environmental devastation around the world and the solutions that he sought. Not one of the solutions involved taxation.
Yeah.
They all involved conservation.
Yeah.
And what you could do. And there's room for conservatives to not alienate their base and still be relevant. But they are loath to get into all of these. And then they dance around, a lot of the, identity stuff. You can't
but before we get into wokeness, because I think wokeness is very much worth unpacking. But just on your point about climate change, And we can say this because we're not partisan and we're not rigidly ideological. Because to your point of, you get shit on social media for saying Pierre Poilievre should stay on as leader. I will double down on your provocation. If the Conservative Party were to adopt the climate policies of the oil and gas industry, it would be a radical improvement. Because at least they'd have a climate policy.
Yeah.
Anyway, you were going to go on to wokeness.
No, they're all backtracking on that, but you're right. I mean, the Pathways Alliance, which is all of the major companies involved in the oil sands, they committed to zero emissions by 20.
Like, you could be critical of it, but at least they have a policy.
Yeah. Now, they wanted to do it almost exclusively through carbon sequestering, which is, a dubious technology and it's massively expensive, requiring tremendous state subsidization. But you're right, at least they acknowledge that this is a problem that they can't ignore, where the Conservatives
or just say nothing.
Exactly nothing. On the wokeness, I mean, again, the Conservatives, they can't kind of help themselves. They want to be, anti-woke. They want to be anti-DEI, but they know they can't get away with it in this country.
But except here's the paradox, and I alluded to it last time. Because they are such an algorithm-driven movement compared to the Liberals, who are still a very polling-driven movement, the algorithms tell them that anti-woke is hot, that it gets them attention, it gets them support, and it gets their base really, really fired up. So it's very paradoxical for them. They're getting all this data that says woke is important, but because you're not ideological and you're not partisan, that some of the fire they're getting is hatred. That it's the other side really fucking pissed off because these issues are so divisive.
Well, it's not even just the other side. You talked about women. You put this on for force. That women tend to be more socially liberal than men. They're also more risk adverse, and I don't say that in a negative way at all. They're more concerned about inflation than men are. They more anti-nuclear power than men. Almost anything that portends more risk, and a divisive, combative politician is included in that laundry list of things I want to avoid. Yeah. And you don't need to be a genius to figure out when Pierre Poilievre was 25 points ahead that had nothing to do with him at all. At all. In fact, even when he was leading like that, his negatives were always greater than his positives overall. So people never warmed up to him as a person.
Well, it's why he had an image makeover. He's not running as the guy he's always been for a reason.
Yeah. But it wasn't that, it was because he was an advocate for things, not that he was a relatable kind of individual that people would like, and especially not a relatable kind of person that women liked. And, that's the other thing. You can't form a government by being, 20 points behind with females. I mean, that's just not going to happen.
Yeah. And it'll be interesting because I think I think internally, largely, the Conservatives do not see this entirely as a loss, right? I think they are wise enough to recognize that they did not actually lose support. The NDP lost a lot of support, and that is a big a narrative around this election.
And they won a lot of conservative liberal seats.
Yes.
Conservatives did. Also again in the 905. Right there. So yeah.
Well, and even in areas they lost, they were still very competitive and did very well. But so to spend a moment talking about the riding of Carleton,
right?
Only because I live right beside it. I spend a lot of time driving through it and engaging the people in it. I'm going to start with a bit of a provocative statement, but I'm doing that to then unroll it. Had Poilievre sat out the Freedom Convoy, the trucker convoy, had he just not gotten involved, not said a word, and just been like, I got nothing to do with this shit, it's whatever, not my business, I think he would have won Carleton hands down. What was interesting, and Fanjoy said this specifically, and this came up in a lot of the local coverage.
The Liberal candidate who won, yeah.
Yeah, that a lot of people did not want to support Poilievre because of his support for the convoy. And I say this because people outside of the Ottawa area, they think the convoy was just this group of annoying people. but they didn't see the violence on the ground. That was
the disruption, to community life.
Yeah, but I mean the actual violence, and this is by extremists, not necessarily Tories, right? But this is the whole, when I was growing up, if you had a party and a Nazi showed up, it was a Nazi party. Right. And this was the problem with the convoy, that it attracted so many extremists who have nothing to do with the Tories, who at best are part of the PPC and Maxime Bernier. That really hurt Poilievre by association.
Well, that's a very interesting thesis. I hadn't even thought about that, to be honest. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. In fact, I hate conspiracy theories and hate conspiracy theorists. But I remember reading the week before the election that Fife at the Globe and Mail had a front page article that Poilievre is in trouble in Carleton. And it was clear he'd been leaked some polling. And the reference was vague, but it could have been polling from the Ontario PCs.
Yeah. Especially now that we know about that feud.
But it wasn't clear whether it was leaked by Liberals or leaked by Ontario PCs. But it said that Poilievre was in real trouble.
Yeah.
And I looked at that and said, that's just fucking irresponsible. Someone's kind of pulling this guy's chain and he's buying the whole thing in. And it's impossible that Pierre Poilievre, who has been the member of parliament there for 21 years, is going to lose that election in a period during which the party has never polled better.
Yeah.
And so I was completely flummoxed by the whole thing and wondered, if there wasn't something larger at work there on the ground that was geared very, very specifically to the goal of Pierre Poilievre losing that riding. Because there's no question it's a huge setback. And it's a setback logistically. He's not going to get into that House where he's the most effective in a minority parliament, probably at least till the fall.
Yeah.
But also it goes to what we were talking about. When your neighbors reject you, when the people you are there to serve say, no, thank you, that really does reflect back very, very poorly on you as a person.
Now,
as a person, and that's where his flaws to begin with. And if his own constituents are echoing that, it's going to have an echo effect.
Now, where I would counterspin that if I were him, and this very much aligns with my convoy hypothesis, he got sunk by former civil servants. Right? When you look at that riding, it's a combination of farmers, right? Rural Ottawa, and Stittsville, a growing suburb, which is overwhelmingly civil servants and retired civil servants. And it's not difficult to say that he was the guy going against big government and, he got burned, and that's why he's going to run in Alberta. Or that's why he's going to run in, some conservative bastion. We'll see how that spin plays. But the argument I'm making here, and this transitions to kind of the next few months in Canadian politics, I agree that he has a path to being prime minister. I agree that he certainly has an interesting mandate amongst his fellow MPs. But I still think that his liability, the thing that he is not factoring in, is his association with extremists and the extent to which red urban Canadians see the contemporary Tory party not just as MAGA Maple, but as extremist. And I say that almost because it's unfair, because I think certainly the Liberals that I've been watching in cities, their perception of rural Canada is prejudicial, right? It's bigoted. Like they have this perception the same way that we talk about Americans and the divide between the coastal elites and the deplorables. I feel that perception exists in Canadian urban centers. But I think Poilievre reinforces it by courting some of the extremists rather than what he should be doing, which is courting some of the more moderate.
Well, if he does, that's just bad politics. Because first, there aren't that many. I mean, even if you look at the conservative voters, only a third say they would vote for Donald Trump. 70% said they wouldn't. But I mean, I worked, as you know, for the Progressive Conservative Party, and there was a time it was a progressive conservative party, a red party, and then especially the leadership. But there were conservative, right-wing conservatives in that party. But the posture of the people who ran the party, who are all progressives, is just ignore those nut bars, because the people they represent, they got nowhere else to go. They're going to vote NDP or Liberal. You know, so why would you cater to these?
But that's the liability, because I agree with you 100%. There is no room for growth. The room for growth is to go in the opposite direction. And I don't think these guys are capable of that. The same way I don't think the Trump people are capable of understanding the impacts of their own incompetence. And I say this to come back to my running hypothesis, which is that Canadian politics is being Americanized. And I think what we're going to see moving forward, especially because Poilievre is going to be out of the house for as much as 6, maybe 8 months, I think we are going to see attack politics on his part. I think Carney is also going to be in attack politics against Trump, because it'll be very popular as we started. And I think that leaves very little room for nuance, which, not to get into it, I think the NDP's fucked. Completely fucked. And if I was Carney, I'd be figuring out how to get those last few NDPers to become Liberal. Like, whatever deal I need to do to get them across the house to get my majority, I'd be doing it. Thoughts?
Those conversations are happening already. You can.
But allow me to ask you because I love it when you go into your crazy policy ideas that are actually not that crazy at all. If you had the power of Mark Carney, what could you offer these NDP MPs to seduce them into switching seats? To literally, and I'm being Machiavellian when I say this, I don't think Carney cares about this. This is me saying this. To kill the NDP. To end the NDP so that because there's no leader coming. Like, Wab Kinu's not going to resign for this. Abby's not going to resign for this. If he could court those MPs and wipe out the NDP entirely, that is a powerful Liberal establishment that could sustain itself. We've been talking about this for a long time, the merger of this left. So I'm asking you to kind of role play. If what could Carney offer them to really seal the deal?
Probably very little is the most honest answer. First, because he recognizes that a big part of his success was moving the Liberal Party to the center. It was way too far to the left to satisfy what is.
So this would undercut.
Yeah. But let me just finish, because in order to actually attract them, I think he would have to become more to the left, at least adopt a couple of big policies to the left. And the things that the NDP right now are most, embracing and most attached to aren't really that radical at all. I mean, it's, instead of 2 drugs, let's put 50 drugs into the pharmacare plan.
But that's why he doesn't have to go left, because the NDP have already gone right. And like, I may be crass. You understand the nuances of politics far better than I do. But I imagine, to your point about a national drug plan, as an example, that you could go to one, maybe 2 of these MPs and say, I'll put you in the cabinet. I'll make you the secretary of drugs and drug plan.
And that's the most obvious inducement. Whether these people are motivated by that, I couldn't tell you, but my guess was no.
Yeah. My guess would be maybe. Because what else do they got going on? Like, to be leader of the federal NDP right now is a non-entity. It's not really a job. They don't have fundraising. They don't have a budget. And to your point, and here I'm going to make another radical prediction, I think we could start seeing unions endorse Poilievre. Like, if the unions are freed up from their NDP historical alliance, I say all bets are off.
Certainly the private sector unions that especially, deal with the blue collar workers. I mean, the thing is, most union members right now are civil servants in Canada. They're public servants.
But the trades, for example, I mean, the same way Trump successfully courted some of the trades unions, again, you think about some of the building policies that the Tories have, certainly that Doug Ford is championing in Ontario. Again, I think we are witnessing a move towards a 2-party system, and that 2-party system allows for much more competition. That's the wrong phrase, but the right concept for union votes, for all sorts of votes, that we're not locked into the usual Canadian alliance of relationships, but there are opportunities to do politics differently. And I think Doug Ford's the poster boy for that.
But
Because
on
in
the other
some
side,
cases he's far right, in some cases he's left of center. It's hard to tell.
And he has built that winning coalition. I mean, he has blue collar voters and he has New Canadians as part of the Ontario PCCO, which is why he's been successful 3 times and why the federal party has been a failure 3 times, because they haven't figured that out or been able to attract those populations. But back on the Liberal NDP side, I mean, maybe what Mark Carney should be doing is not so much trying to recruit those members right now, but recruiting our friend Yasmin or Jim Stanford, who are serious, innovative policy thinkers who are on the left, to say, what could I be doing that wouldn't jeopardize my position here, but would also satisfy a more radical element. And maybe they'll come back and say, you should nationalize the R&D function of the pharmaceutical industry in this country. Mm-hmm. So doing fuck all anyway. Give universities, a huge whack of dough to set up a center of IP excellence in the pharmaceutical thing, and we'll make our own drugs here in Canada for sale around the world, and that we will give the scientists a piece of the IP as part of it.
But this is why, we have a podcast and not a political party. A, that would be a brilliant idea. B, I'd be shocked if Carney thought of it. C, I can guarantee Stanfield would be a snob and say, no way. Right? And that's the paradox of Canadian politics, that it has a certain kind of rigid partisanship that is outdated, and that I think is leading us towards a similar type of jingoistic politics that we see in the United States. I say this partly because while there is still an element of function in Canadian politics, I think we are in a crisis that will resurface because Trump does still want to annex us. That much is fundamentally still clear. I don't know if you saw, but Doug Ford, either today or yesterday, started to make attacks on the Ontario judiciary. Granted, he has no power to do so, but he was talking about the judiciary being elected, which I thought was an interesting kind of undermining. Without going off the conservative thing, to what extent is this Ford versus Poilievre, this Corey Chanak versus Jamil Giovanni? Right. How much of this is just petty Tory politics, or how much of this, to go back to what I'm describing, is a reconfiguration of the rigidity of Canadian politics and into something completely different?
Or it may just be sheer ambition. Doug Ford is now the most successful politician in Ontario history. Maybe he wants to be the next Prime Minister of Canada. I've been involved in party politics. You don't do that. It doesn't matter whether you disagree with your fellow conservative. You don't stand up in the middle of an election and shit all over them and make yourself the center of the controversy. It's just not done, unless there is something really at work here. You mentioned Jamal. His reaction, again, you couldn't see it till about 12:30 at night, but was just vitriolic against Ford. And he worked for Ford, seeing this as nothing other than an attempt to, blindside Poilievre and to take over the party themselves, what he called goons. So there's something there. And again, I'm not privy to precisely what that is, but it's more than just your classic party politics. It's anti-party politics.
Yeah, that's my point, that it is an unraveling of party discipline, which I loathe. I will always point out opportunities in which party discipline is being eroded. But both of these guys, neither of these I felt were random statements. Like Corey Tanak made his comments on David Hurley's podcast, a liberal podcast. That was very deliberate.
I think he was at an Empire Club or something when he did the first one. So it wasn't,
And similarly, Jamal Giovanni did it on CBC.
Yeah.
Right? Like, they are choosing their outlets to get the maximum impact. And both of these guys are enforcers for their respective camps. And Jamil in particular is the JD Vance connection.
Yeah.
Right? That also kind of adds intrigue to all this. Now, I also have to bring in, I'm kind of conscious that we're almost out of time, but Danielle Smith, also seems to be inserting herself into the national stage in a way that can't be productive for the federal Conservative Party. But further to my hypothesis on the Americanization of Canadian politics, she sure seems to want to be American. What's going on here? What's your reading of how this is being received in Alberta?
Well, again, she just can't help herself, it seems. I don't think she's reflective of the larger sentiment out there at all. And we talked about urban-rural, and you see that at play more in Alberta probably than any other province in the country right now. The division between rural Albertan and a downtown Edmontonian is huge, and she's just got this whole grievance kind of the West wants in sentiment. No, they did a poll, and more.
But it's more the West wants out. No,
no. More Quebecers believe that they are respected by the rest of Canada than Albertans do. There is this real sense that, we have all of this stuff. You don't appreciate the fact that we have all this stuff. We give you a disproportionate amount of this stuff through equalization payments. You don't appreciate that. You're constantly shitting on our industries. You're putting caps on their production. And, it's just bad. And you tend to be liberals. And so now you've got a fourth term. And that's just the ground is there to be tilled, and that's what she's trying to do. Whether much grows out of it, I doubt it.
So the two responses there. I think it's fair to argue that she's tilling that ground for her own personal benefits, right? To guarantee that she will continue to be reelected as premier and, to keep the NDP or the Liberals in Alberta at bay. But the other side to this is how much she needs to get things to grow. And I think this is another kind of difference between us as researchers, where you as the mainstream guy, you look towards the mean, or you look towards the popular sentiment as an anchor, versus me as the outlier. I look at the minorities as the drivers. And I see in her someone with a lot of ambition, and I think we're gonna find out whether this is true in the months to come, the weeks and months to come. I really do think she aspires to be American. And I agree with you. I think sentiment in Alberta for that right now is very, very low. Alberta is a very proud part of the country. But I do think that she is going to move in that direction. And I do think that she will be an ally of the Trump administration in a way that may be pathetic and incompetent in light of the Trump administration. But this is why, going back to Poilievre and the extremists, this urban-rural divide thing is something that I think is not only bigger than a lot of people realize, and a lot of people do think it's big, but I think that's where we have the grounds for extremism on both sides. And I mean extremism in the urban in terms of, and this is where I would support climate extremism. I am politically aligned with that, but rural people would find it terrifying. Farmers find it terrifying versus the rural extremism, which does align more with the convoy stuff and does align more with some of the conservative stuff in terms of the anti-wokeness. I see these things as festering. I see these things as growing because we don't have, again, to go to your brilliant idea of Carney tapping into left-wing researchers to find post-ideological policy. Nobody's actually doing that. They're doing the opposite. They're doubling down on a more partisan view of the world. And that's where I worry about the role of these minorities and extremists moving forward.
Back to the point you were making about Danielle Smith and her positions in Alberta. Where that element that you see as being drivers have found a home is in party organizations, not so much in kind of mainstream sentiment or public opinion. And I mean, her leadership was up for review just a couple of months ago, 6-7 months ago. And again, there was lots of talk that she was in trouble. This is a party that dumped Jason Kenney, for Christ's sake, for being too middle of the road. So the people who, there's a Republican Party leader in their ranks. He calls himself the Republican Party of Alberta, and they have taken over some organizations like the United Conservatives, and not the voting base, but the actual party organization. And so, a lot of her posturing isn't to the electorate in order to win another election. It's to her own party members, not just base members, to ensure that she stays in their good graces and doesn't get dumped.
So that is a brilliant insight, and it ties to my point about how the political right is driven by algorithms, not polling. They're looking at the most passionate. They're looking at the most engaged. They're looking at, and political parties have not attracted those who believe in policy, those who believe in democracy. It's attracted those who believe. Right? It's about a kind of zealotry and partisanship. And Jamil Giovanni is the poster boy of that. Right? And that's where I think you're absolutely right, that they are playing to a party core. And I think this is exactly what's going to happen to Poilievre. And they are disconnecting from the actual public. They're disconnecting from people's needs. And this is my concern in the Americanization of Canadian politics, that it'll become partisan, rather than policy, rather than democracy, rather than historically, I think how we see Canada as a cliche, a conversation where we can all get along and all figure it out. Any final thoughts before we conclude?
No, it's been a fascinating week, and the point that you made too, I think the people who are listening should take to heed, is there is no honeymoon for Mark Carney here, notwithstanding the fact that the Liberals have got to be pinching themselves with their good luck over the course of the last 4 months. There's tremendous pressure on him to get out of the gate on the economy, get out of the gate on Canada-U.S. relations, get out on the gate in terms of global leadership and diplomacy. And so that's going to make things continually to be exciting. So keeps us in business.
Well, and allow me then to end with a golf metaphor. I think, to your point, it is a risk and reward scenario. So Carney finds himself on a par 5, and he really needs to get on the green in 2. There's a lot of hazards, there's a lot of trouble, but he needs 2 really big, strong shots so that he's got a chance for eagle. I think this is fundamentally what Canada needs in this moment, and I think the opportunity's there. So hopefully he's not too risk averse, because the risks are not his of his own choosing. The risk is the supply chain. The risk is Trump. The risk is the larger global geopolitical reconfiguration. So let's hope he can pull that off.
Let's get that 3-wood out of your bag for your second shot there, Mark.
There you go. Or drive her off the deck in the old Tiger Woods style. He's got the skills.
Yes. There you go. For sure.
All right, we'll be back. One of our episodes 3 episodes ago, where we talked about polling and stuff, has actually attracted a decent YouTube audience. So people are starting to tune into the podcast, and they're posting comments saying they're glad to be part of the podcast. So give us a rating on your favorite podcast app, share our videos from YouTube, and we'll see you soon.
Talk Friday, Jesse.